Good afternoon. This is my first video here on this channel. I have another channel where I have been talking about my car and how to repair it or what I did. This channel here is more for genuine, everyday occurrences, events, and my take on those. The current world events have a reason that this has developed and resulted in this of what we got. And I would like to be able for people to watch this globally, so I'm going to be politically correct in the way I will say this. This is an opinion what I'm bringing here, what I'm presenting, and it is also, I'm trying to be as objective as I possibly can be, because only the facts should be discussed here. And to look at the reaction or the response of the Russian Federation on why they started to get into this is we have a public statement or public, explanation for this from the Russian government, that they're saying they want to denazify the country and they want to demilitarize the Ukraine, basically both. That, of course, in my opinion, is somewhat a smokescreen. And there's another reason behind this, and that is called globalization and global capitalism. And the question is, how did we get here? I'm not here to criticize this or think that socialism, communism is better than capitalism. That is up to the individual to decide. I'm a capitalist by background, so I'm not really in favor. I'm not trying to present you the advantages of one situation or the other, or political system or economical system. We have to go back to a time of 1928, probably, shortly before the big crash came. And as we know, or as history has told us, is in 1928, there was already a brewing right-wing nationalism in Germany as a result of World War I and the Versailles Treaty, which caused a big shift in the populace towards the right, with the reparations which had to be paid and the, hyperinflation in the Weimar Republic and that sort of stuff. That is basically your starting point for everything what we got today. This is how far we have to go back. And when we look at this, that culminated then in 1932, 1933, when everything got even worse economically, not just in Germany, but in Europe as well, to the anti-Semitic rhetoric what we had in the action which followed by the Nazi government. And one has to understand about the Nazi government is that the Nazi government is not a capitalist operating system. This is what most people don't understand. It is a national socialist movement, and you have to be German. That's basically it, or Aryan, to make it even more precise. And the word democracy is not even part of this picture. And the Nazis also had a 4 or 5 year plan, if I remember this correctly, similar to communism. So it was originally the left-wing worker environment, labor environment, which that originated from, but they shifted to the right, but they're politically, economically to the left. The Nazi government, Hitler started to print unbelievable amount of money, the Reichsmark back then. Then he put a price cap on food and everyday products that was price regulated by the government. That's the first indication that you have a socialist, communist type environment. When you have government regulating pricing of markets, so the market no longer determines the price for a particular part or everyday product, whatever you have, The price is no longer driven by demand and supply. That is completely out of the picture. And this way they were able to fumble the money they printed in there without getting a hyperinflation. That was basically the result. The German people in this time, or during that time of the 1930s, they were not able to procure food in unlimited quantities. They were rationed, and they had little booklets with stamps in it where they were assigned, depending on the size of the family, on how much meat, butter, milk, and so on they could procure. Anyway, as we all know, this system collapsed in 1945, thank God. From there on, this was basically the ground zero at that point for the world in general. And the Marshall Plan, which was enacted through the Bretton Woods Agreement between the United States and England, or the United Kingdom at the time, saw a restructuring of Europe, or the restarting of the western side of Europe, and the governments needed to be funded. So the national currencies eventually were then tied to the US dollar. And that basically created the staging point for Western Europe, and the Russians did something, or the Soviet Union did something similar in the countries they liberated. At that point, liberation is usually you liberate the people there, and then you leave. In this particular instance, after 1945, as the Red Army moved from the Soviet Union over towards the West, and they pushed the Wehrmacht away, or out of the way, or destroyed it, delimited, demilitarized it, whatever you want to call it, they winded up staying in Poland and all the liberated countries, and instead of having free and fair elections, democratic elections, they instituted communist governments, puppet governments, basically. That set the entire stage. This was between 1945 and 1950 for whatever was to come later on in terms of the Cold War. Now, then we know from history is that we divided. We had the Warsaw Pact states as a military alliance, and we had NATO, which was then formed in the 1950s on both sides. And that fell apart in about 1989, and the Soviet Union then collapsed in 1991 in August. At that point, we had what we would call, or what I would call, national economies in Western Europe. To a certain extent, the Warsaw Pact states were the same. They had national economies, but the communist belief system was also such that it would be better for one country to produce one item for all the other countries. So you had some decentralization or centralization of particular manufacturing activity. And one big disagreement between the East German government in the 1960s, with Walter Ulbricht being in charge of East Germany, and I think it was Brezhnev at the time, this was the late 60s. Brezhnev told Ulbricht that they had to close down the East German car manufacturers, Wartburg, Trabant, and they wanted to build cars now only in the Soviet Union. And East Germany would be supplied from the Soviet Union with cars. And Walter Ulbricht didn't like that idea. So he told him no, and as we know, he was dethroned, and then Erich Honecker came in, and they still kept making cars in East Germany, but the Russians supplied less and less material for it, raw materials, since most of the raw materials, iron ore and aluminum and that sort of stuff, came out of the Soviet Union at that point into the member states. So this is how that centralized control system worked. Now, capitalists, on the other hand, in the Western section, went ahead and established after 1949 with the West German monetary system and the establishment of West Germany as a country with a national economy. And they imported very little, and most of it was whatever we had nationally available in resources. And this system stayed in place, and until about the late 1960s, 1960s. In the 1960s, the German capitalists, primarily the mail order businesses, catalog-based mail order businesses, Quelle was the biggest one of them out of Bavaria. They went to the East German government, Walter Ulbricht at that time, and they said, can you make us in your nationalized, governmentized factories products like electrical household equipment, hand mixers, toaster ovens, and that sort of stuff, because the labor rate was a lot cheaper in East Germany than by the time in the mid-60s in West Germany. The same picture evolved in the United States, where they started to look here to cheaper manufacturing, and the first two places they discovered was Japan and South Korea. And they went over there with the electronics, hi-fi electronics at that point, stereos, color televisions, and that sort of stuff. And the Japanese started to produce them, and as we all know, swamped the Western world literally with Sony, Samsung, TIAC, and God knows who else came out of this in the 1960s, beginning about the mid-60s probably until the 80s and 90s, well into this. They became the foremost manufacturing centers, and the building of those type consumer-related products basically faded completely out here in the United States, whether it was General Electric or Maytag. The next step up in this was East Germany now had that going with West Germany, that they would basically build these things, and they also made furniture. Anything you could order basically out of a Sears catalog was first made in the 1950s in West Germany, and that whole production then moved over for consumer-related products into East Germany. Here in the United States, it moved into Japan and South Korea at first. Then they started to tag in Malaysia, Thailand, Taiwan, those countries, and the Philippines, little by little. And then, of course, NAFTA originated here to do some of the stuff down in Mexico for the cheap labor and raw materials out of Canada. So you had that corridor going through where the United States really just facilitated this is the beginning of globalization, what I'm explaining here. And so this whole thing started in the late 60s and it matured in the 1980s, then fully coming to effect in the 1990s. Now, what East Germany or what West Germany hadn't banked on was that the wall would come down in 1989. That almost instantaneously destroyed their cheap labor country, primarily East Germany. Poland had been used at that point, and the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia at that point. These were the three main manufacturing centers for consumer-related products in the 1970s and 80s for West Germany. And France and Holland had moved in other countries. That fell almost out because once the wall opened and the reunification happened, the differences for one is they had Westmark now, or just the Deutschmark in the unified Germany. That made the labor rate almost increase by 200-300% overnight. So all of the cheap products they were able to make, and Poland was basically then the same story, and the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia was the same story there too. All of the cheap labor had gone out of the window. On the other side is the Japanese had gone through a crash. They had gotten rich of this whole thing. The labor rates were through the sky. Everything is unionized basically now in North Korea, in South Korea, and in Japan. And you have the same movements now starting to take place in the former Comecon countries, Warsaw Pact countries. The same thing as democracy moves in with it comes to labor movement and everything else, and wages and everything start to increase rather rapidly. At this point, now I have to go back and give you a little example. In 1991, I traveled to the United States from Germany, and I had to stop in Hong Kong for 2 or 3 days on business. And I flew from Frankfurt to Hong Kong. I took care of my business. I had to take care of them. And then I flew from Hong Kong to Tokyo on the now defunct Northwest airline. And then from Tokyo to New York City. It's quite a flight. And I was sitting next to the head purchasing manager of Radio Shack on the flight from Hong Kong to Tokyo. He was then taking the Northwest flight into Minneapolis, and I was going on the other flight to New York. So we had a 5-hour flight together. And he started talking to me. We got into, talking. And he said, we're buying now because, like I said, East Germany had collapsed at this point as a cheap labor market, so did Poland and Czechoslovakia. This was happening in 89, 90 already. The unification was in the middle of July 1990, I believe it was, October 3rd, 1990. And my flight was in the middle of August of 1991. And he said, Radio Shack, looking at the high labor rates in Japan, had to go, they were looking already for other places. And they had a deal in Hong Kong with the Hong Kong Chinese, which was still a UK territory at this point, or UK possession, in 1991. And what they would do is they would buy this from the local Hong Kong Chinese, so UK citizens. And those people would bring merchandise illegally from the manufacturing hubs in mainland China over the border, Macau, that area down there, Kowloon, where you can cross into mainland China. And so Radio Shack would go to the middleman in Hong Kong. They would say, we need these parts and this and this and this, and supply them with drawings. They would take these drawings over into mainland China to the Chinese manufacturers, which were basically government controlled. They would start making those parts. They went then to Hong Kong and were shipped out from Hong Kong to the United States, labeled as made in Hong Kong, even though they were made in China at the time. And because China was not yet part of the World Trade Organization, and there was still laws in effect which prohibited any purchase out of mainland China from the Cold War reminiscence. That kind of faded all the way in the 1990s with Bill Clinton and the Democrats and quite a few Republicans involved in the state. They all got under the bandwagon. And that's how we winded up. Basically, whatever was in Japan shifted over to China, and whatever was still here in the United States being manufactured was now shifted over to China. The invention which really made this possible came in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and that is 40-foot and 20-foot containers. Container shipping made that possible because the container ships could be built to accommodate the containers. You can have the terminals almost automated. You have no single piece merchandise which needs to be handled, and the unloading can be done, and then you can either move the container by truck or you can move it by rail. And the United States started to develop their rail network. The United States has one, not known to most people, one of the best rail networks in the world, but they're primarily moving every cargo by railroad, whether it's new vehicles coming from Mexico, going to Canada, or whatever the merchandise is, it is probably moved by container or by rail at one point or another. So the biggest part of the United States. So the United States has a highly sophisticated railroad network for cargo movements with very, very big railroad yards where these trains can be put together and taken apart and rerouted and everything. It's a little bit slow, but this is how probably 80 to 90% of merchandise cargo moves in the United States is by rail. This was then developed, and that came more and more into the picture. So they built this up. So the philosophy was they took the idea from the communists where you centralize manufacturing in an area where there's cheap labor available, cheap energy, anything cheap, and you do other things in the other countries. So each country develops their own specialized economy. And those economies are not very resistant to recessions or any type of disruptions, because you have to have a flow of all of the stuff going forwards. So now you have American companies providing accounting and legal services over to companies in Asia. You have the Asians building all of the merchandise, what we need, consumer stuff, and a lot of industrial stuff by now too. Industrial control gear, machines, equipment, and everything else. That is then shipped, so each one has their own specialty. The European Union and the Americans, or the WTO, basically talked the Russians into this under Boris Yeltsin. And Yeltsin didn't quite understand this concept, so when Putin appeared in late 99, early 2000, they thought they had found their guy who was able to get this going for them. And he did. This put now the Russian Federation into this big mix. And the primary products coming out of Russia are raw materials. That means iron ore, aluminum, copper, nickel, palladium, that stuff, coal, oil, gas, rare earth metals, material metals, everything you need in what manufacturing needs at one point or another in another part of the world, and grain agricultural production, because they have vast amounts of land where they can grow stuff. So this has put now Russia in a predicament where the Russian industry builds very little itself. And I saw this, the Ukrainian army caught a Russian drone which had all Japanese-made RC, radio control products in there, and a Canon camera and some specialized circuit board. Everything is Japanese made in there. We can purchase most of these parts in that drone at Hobby Lobby here in the United States, because the RC, these people who build these model airplanes and model cars and boats and that stuff, they use these things, and they're selling them here at the Hobby Lobby. So the military companies over there were forced, because of unavailability of this stuff and the lack of knowledge how to produce this, from the Japanese in this case. And this is how you wind up. This is this global intertwined thing. So the Russians can build anything electronically on a very limited basis. We do very little of this here. We shifted everything over for our engineering over to India, because the Indian electrical engineers work at a third at the cost of an American or a German engineer. And the story goes on, and they're producing this stuff then in China. And this is about to come to an end. And Putin has realized this at one point or another, that this kind of an alliance is basically what the Soviet Union had until it collapsed with the Warsaw Pact, and their economic system was called Comecon. That was all the Eastern European countries together in a economic alliance, basically similar to the European Union or to NAFTA. And in that picture with Comecon, the Soviet Union was basically the center of it, where the control and everything was orchestrated, planned out, and they were basically in control of it. And with this war, with this disruption, the primary reason for getting into the Ukraine the way they wanted to get into this is because they want the Ukraine, this is my belief, the Ukraine in the former Soviet Union was one of their main manufacturing hubs, whether it was Antonov, the airplane manufacturer and engine manufacturers were there, and they have also resources there. And they had most of the power production, nuclear power plants, like we know with Chernobyl. There's, I think, 3 or 4 more like this. And those things, Russia, it's missing in the Russian Federation. So when the EU offered them, or when Russia, before they got rid of their president they had there in the Ukraine, and what was it, 2013, 2014, they were talking about having the Comecon basically again. A little bit smaller, but it is the first beginning of this, an independent alliance of the former Soviet states on an economical basis to counter-react the globalization, primarily the control. They were not as happy to get, they were trying to get rid of the control of the United States in Europe, which is the two predominant forces in globalization. And they wanted to undo this, basically. So they went through this, and then the EU came in and they said, well, we can, offer this to you, and we give you money, and you become an EU member. That's when they said the Russian, close alliance president at the time said no to the European Union. And that's when the revolution happened, the Maidan Revolution, and that led to Crimea, the occupation of Crimea. And the statement now from Putin says to Nazis, he looks at the Nazis, at those people, these are basically nationalists. They're not really Nazis because they're, first of all, not Aryan. Secondly, the system they have is not even close or remotely aligned with any form socialistic, not as I can see. So that leaves them as national extremist separatists from the Russian Federation. And of course, that strategy now of starting the special military operations is not the ideal way of trying to align a former partner back into another alliance to minimize the impact of globalization. And so we have now, this is basically what culminated into this war. The nationalists being aligned with the Europeans, in that sense with the European Union, or the move into this direction, and the counter reaction was, or has been in this case, the Russian Federation and their idea of basically reestablishing Comecon. This was also the reason behind these wars they had with Georgia and Chechnya. These are more or less important parts in this entire Comecon picture for the Soviet Union. Now, what this is going to do is the Western world has become heavily dependent upon the exports of Russian raw materials, primarily, and the other nations in this, primarily in Africa and Asia, they have become very, very dependent upon the grain and other food production out of the Russian Federation and out of the Ukraine, both countries. And this has basically fallen off at this point. So this is going to reshape our globalization in general. What I believe is that we're going to see a turn back to more and more national economies, and the idea basically that you centralize everything in one part of the world or another, after having had COVID now for 2 years and the Chinese still being in lockdown mode, and this is lockdown and that, has proven itself as a very, very difficult operation despite containers and air cargo shipping and everything else. This is the reality. And now the war. The war is really an expression of a dislike of a codependent relationship the Russian Federation has, or they're viewing it as a codependent relationship, which I personally dislike too. You want to be independent, of other nations, in not ingrained in an economical system to this extent. And so this is going to be undone. The European Union and the West has announced they're going to isolate the Russian Federation when this war is over, or has started already with the sanctions. On the other hand, I believe that this is a planned move of the Kremlin, because it will lead the Russian Federation back into an independent entity, out of the fangs of the globalized capitalism. So they're going to have some form of national capitalism in the Russian Federation and the countries which are close to Russia. And it's going to look a little bit more like a Comecon environment, and it will counter-offset China. They have not gotten into the trade yet with the Chinese to the extent anyone else has. So there's an underlying fear in Russia, especially in Russia, is that the Chinese one day gonna march into the Russian Federation with a war, basically with military force, to annex land so they can accommodate their 1.5 billion people they have in Russia, in China, and to open up this wide country there between the Ural Mountains and Vladivostok, for food production and the natural resources in there. This has always been a fear of Russia since the end of World War II, that the Chinese one day are gonna move in. If that's gonna happen or not, I couldn't tell you. Anyway, so this is basically the starting point as where we are today. Is the West going to be thrown in a recession or in a food disaster? I don't think so. For one is because our food sources can be quickly changed. Here in the United States, we have vast amounts of agricultural land which is not being used. The farmers are getting paid by the government. That can be, utilized within a year, 2 years. You have food production here again. So there won't be any real food shortages. We're not going to run out of this, that, or the other thing. In terms of steel and raw metals, this is going to be a different story. We have seen this in the prices, that there is a supply and demand. So as we're reopening the country, the demand has gone up, but it will not affect the, overall, we won't have any shortages where there's nothing going to be available at all anymore. This is going to reshift, the Canadians can pick some of the stuff up. We have mines over here which haven't been utilized in years or decades because of cheaper imports. If the price is high enough, they will reopen the mining here, and they will bring on iron ore and copper or silver, whatever you may need here locally in the United States. And there's mining in Latin America, which can be, increased in terms of it if they needed to bring the stuff in. So there's alternate areas. So the overall shift is this basically Putin, no matter how this war is going to end, whether he's going to take the Ukraine or not, I kind of doubt it. They would have to go probably in a much bigger war than what they are in at the moment. So if they settle for the Donbass really is nothing, in terms of a regional area. If they take over Mariupol all the way down to Odessa, then the Ukrainian whatever's left of the Ukraine is landlocked if that is under Russian control. They have no more seaports, and the railroad system, when that was built, it was under the Tsar. I forgot which one it was, 1850 to 1890, 1910, in that range. And the Tsar made a decision back then to develop the Russian railroad with a different railroad track than what Western Europe had used. So if you use a train today, you can go to the Polish border to the Ukraine or Belarus, and they have to change the carriages underneath the cars to the wider tracks for the Russians. And the Tsar did this on purpose. He was afraid that the Western European monarchies would start a war with him to take over land in Russia. And to slow down troop movement was they changed the track with. And interestingly enough, the Ukraine also utilizes the wider track system than what they have in the Russian Federation back out of the Tsar time. I mean, we're going back over 130 years when this was developed. And the Ukraine has never changed their railroad tracks, not that I'm aware of, to the narrower system for Europe. If they had the narrower system, all they could do is just load up the grain and raw materials, what they're mining and building and stuff like this, and put them on the railroad and send them over to Poland. This is a very drawn-out process. Basically, any country which borders to Moldova, along that line, so the Czech Republic, the Slovak Republic, Poland, and Romania, their train systems is the narrow track, and you cannot just go by train from one country to the other. There's a multiple hour stop involved because every car, like I said, is they have to lift the car up, roll the white tracks if they're going west out, and then roll the narrow tracks underneath it and set the car down. And you have to do this for every single car. So you can imagine if you have a American train with 200 cars, and they have two cars under two trolley systems underneath it, that takes you a week almost to get through this, you know. So this is the overall situation here. And I'm probably going to post this video a little bit later on, and then we will see if I'm going to post another video. If you like the video, please feel free to like, and please feel free to subscribe to my channel. This is not going to be a constant posting here. I will voice myself here and trying to explain a few things as time permits. And the other thing is we will watch the comments, what they go. I may turn the comments off if it goes too far out. Then we just don't have any comments. I do not like to censor things, but then on the other thing is I do not want to be in the middle between two sides starting to argue about things. So, because this is my channel, and I just don't have then any comments, and then you can watch this for educational purposes. And with that, you have a great day.